Tokyo, March 1945. The air raid sirens had faded, leaving behind the dull hum of silence that felt heavier than any explosion. In a cramped wooden house near Ueno Station, a family huddled in darkness. The father, a railway clerk, turned the small radio dial slowly, the way one touches a wound. Every click risked imprisonment. Every whisper of foreign sound was treason. Static hissed. Then, through the fog of interference, came a clear male voice. Calm, American, impossibly confident. To the families of captured soldiers of the Imperial Army, your sons are safe. They are being fed rice, fish, and soup every day in American camps. The mother gasped. The youngest child stared at her, not understanding. The father froze, eyes wide. The broadcast continued, describing warm meals, medical care, letters being sent home. It was not the words that terrified them. It was the tone. There was no mockery, no anger, only kindness. And that was what made it unbearable. The mother covered her mouth, whispering, "If this is true, what else have they lied about?" Outside, a single bomb smoldered in the distance. Inside, for the first time, they no longer feared the enemy. They feared the truth. By 1944, the Pacific War had turned from expansion to endurance. Japan, once the aggressor, was now cornered, bombarded, and starving. Entire cities rationed scraps. The military's control over information had become absolute. Newspapers, radio stations, even school lessons served one voice: the imperial narrative. Every broadcast proclaimed that the empire was unbroken, its soldiers heroic, and its enemies savage. The idea of surrender was erased from the Japanese imagination. Within this sealed world, the only truth was what the government allowed. The Home Ministry's censorship bureau, known as Johokyoku, monitored every word transmitted through Japan's fragile airwaves. Listening to foreign stations was a crime punishable by arrest. Yet, as the war dragged on and bombs began to fall closer to home, curiosity crept through the fear. People whispered that if you turned the radio dial late at night, beyond the sanctioned frequencies, you could hear strange voices speaking Japanese, soft, slow, and unnervingly calm. Those voices belonged to the Voice of America and other allied shortwave operations run by the Office of War Information, OWI. Their mission was simple: to puncture Japan's psychological armor, not with bombs, but with information. The OWI broadcast from Saipan, Manila, and San Francisco, using fluent Japanese speakers, some expatriates, others Nisei, second-generation Japanese Americans, who delivered messages crafted to shock through truth. By early 1945, as the firebombing of Tokyo intensified, these transmissions began to focus less on battle reports and more on morality. The most unsettling messages weren't threats, they were descriptions of kindness. American radio operators knew that mercy would sound more terrifying to an indoctrinated population than any threat of invasion. A typical broadcast began like this: "Good evening to the people of Japan. This is Radio San Francisco. Your sons who were captured in the Philippines and Guam are alive and well. They have received hot meals and are being treated with respect, as required by the Geneva Convention. America fights soldiers, not families." To the average Japanese listener, such words bordered on heresy. The state's propaganda had long declared that Allied forces tortured and mutilated prisoners. Soldiers were told that capture was worse than death. They were to commit suicide rather than surrender. Families of missing men were told their sons had died honorably, even when they had been taken alive. So when American broadcasts described those same prisoners being served rice, miso soup, and fish, the effect was shattering. To the Japanese mind, it meant two impossible things at once. The emperor's war machine had lied, and the enemy was capable of compassion. Secret police reports from late 1944 mentioned civilians caught weeping or trembling after hearing Allied broadcasts. One intelligence memo stated, "Such mercy creates more confusion than fear." That confusion was precisely the goal. The Obawi understood that Japan's strength lay in unity built on fear. To unravel it, they offered not threats, but humanity. Meanwhile, within the Japanese government, the tension between propaganda and reality was becoming unsustainable. Officials in the Home Ministry knew these transmissions were reaching the public, but they could not fully block them. The airwaves were porous. Radios in rural towns picked up the strange broadcasts with eerie clarity at night. People began to gather secretly, pretending to adjust antennas or check frequencies, but really listening for that soft foreign voice. What they heard undermined everything the empire stood for. These were not demonic foreigners. They were rational, even gentle. And that was far more frightening than cruelty. For cruelty could be resisted, but mercy made resistance feel hollow. By the spring of 1945, those voices from the sky had become Japan's quietest but most devastating weapon of truth. Invisible, unstoppable, and deeply human. By the time American bombers filled the skies above Japan, the nation's most powerful weapon was no longer the sword, but silence. Official news spoke only of glorious counterattacks and divine victories. Even as cities turned to ash, radio announcers described splendid tactical withdrawals. To question such reports aloud was unthinkable, to believe them increasingly impossible. And yet, every night across Japan's collapsing empire, a few brave civilians risked everything to turn the dial just a fraction to the right. The static between sanctioned frequencies became a lifeline to another world. From it came a voice both foreign and intimate, one that spoke Japanese fluently, softly, even kindly. "Your sons who surrendered in Saipan are alive. They have rice, blankets, and medicine. Captured Japanese receive fair treatment. They are building gardens. They write letters home. America will not harm those who lay down their arms." For a population raised on the idea that surrender erased honor, these words were like hearing ghosts. To be a prisoner meant to cease existing. Families of the captured were erased from neighborhood registries, their relatives shunned, their names whispered as curses. And yet here, across the forbidden airwaves, came confirmation that those lost souls were alive and being treated better by the enemy than by their own government. The shock of mercy cut deeper than any bomb. Japan's entire wartime ideology rested on moral superiority, the belief that Western decadence had weakened the Allies while Japan stood pure and disciplined. The broadcasts shattered that illusion. "How can an evil nation feed its enemies?" whispered listeners asked one another behind shuttered doors. To admit that Americans treated prisoners kindly was to admit that the moral axis of the war had shifted. At first, many dismissed the messages as lies, but the Allies anticipated this doubt. The OWI's psychological warfare branch began releasing verifiable details. Camp names, prisoner rosters, even direct quotations from captured Japanese officers describing their meals and medical care. Leaflets dropped over coastal towns repeated these claims, signed with the insignia of the Geneva Convention. "Ask your government," they read, "why your sons are treated better by us than by them." These small details, rice bowls, miso soup, warm beds, spread like contagion. Civilians repeated them in whispers. Mothers dared to hope that their sons might be among those prisoners with full stomachs. But hope under tyranny was dangerous. It implied doubt, and doubt in wartime Japan was treason. Police reports preserved after the war revealed dozens of arrests for illegal listening. Families were interrogated for possessing shortwave radios. One report from Niigata describes a woman who broke down crying after hearing an American broadcast announce, captured Japanese are allowed to pray to their gods freely. The woman confessed that her husband had been declared dead in the Philippines 2 years earlier. "If they feed him," she said, "then perhaps they are not devils." The authorities could imprison listeners, but they could not imprison what they felt. For the first time, civilians saw the fracture between the myth and the truth. The empire's power depended on the conviction that Japan fought a holy war against beasts. But when the beasts began feeding the defeated, holiness lost its footing. Even as the bombs grew louder, the radios became more dangerous. People huddled in cellars to hear the latest broadcasts, torn between fear of the Kempeitai and hunger for honesty. The irony was cruel. America's greatest act of psychological warfare was not a threat, but an act of decency. By the summer of 1945, when firestorms consumed Tokyo and the emperor prepared his first and final address, much of Japan's civilian morale had already collapsed, not only from ruin, but from revelation. The truth had arrived through static and mercy, one forbidden broadcast at a time. When mercy became terrifying. For the Japanese civilian in 1945, the word American meant monster. For years, newsreels and textbooks had described the enemy as cannibalistic, cruel, devoid of humanity. Children were taught that Allied soldiers laughed as they slaughtered innocents. Mothers whispered to their children that capture meant dismemberment, or worse. So when the forbidden radio crackled with an American voice offering comfort and food to Japanese prisoners, it didn't bring relief. It brought paralysis. In the dim light of bomb shelters, listeners stared at one another in disbelief. "If the enemy feeds us," one mother whispered, "then who are the barbarians?" The emotional shock was immense. Civilians trembled, not from fear of violence, but from the collapse of their moral compass. The empire had built its legitimacy on purity, sacrifice, and divine right. If the barbarians were now behaving more humanely than the emperor's own officers, then the foundation of loyalty itself began to rot. Psychological Warfare Division analysts later wrote that compassion entered Japan's mind like a knife. The simple phrase, "free meals for captured soldiers," contained more power than any bomb. It reframed the entire conflict, showing that America's strength was not only in firepower, but in principle. Those broadcasts quietly accomplished what propaganda rarely could. They forced ordinary people to think. And in a nation built on obedience, thought was revolution. Honor versus reality. Inside Japan's military hierarchy, surrender was spiritual suicide. Soldiers were taught that capture would disgrace their families for generations. To die by one's own hand was preferable to living under the enemy's mercy. The Senjin-kun, or Field Service Code, issued in 1941, left no ambiguity. Do not live in shame as a prisoner. This doctrine created one of the most extreme military cultures in history, one that conflated death with duty. So when word began to leak through about American treatment of Japanese POWs, the hot rice, the medical tents, the Red Cross parcels, officers refused to believe it. They labeled such reports psychological poison. Yet the stories spread anyway. Intercepted letters from Allied camps, filtered through Red Cross channels, reached a few families in secrecy. A sergeant's postcard from Guam read simply, "I am alive, they gave me tea." The Japanese censors destroyed most of these, but not before rumors spread that captured men were, impossibly, being allowed to live. For junior soldiers, these whispers carried unbearable weight. Some began to wonder whether dying for honor was truly better than living with dignity. The first cracks of moral disobedience appeared not on battlefields, but in the private thoughts of men who realized that their enemies lived by a code more humane than their own. Information as shock therapy. The Americans had not stumbled into mercy by chance. It was calculated. The OWI and its psychological warfare branch had studied Japanese culture closely. They understood that Japan's moral structure depended on absolute belief in its moral superiority. To defeat the nation's body, bombs would suffice, but to defeat its spirit, they needed contradiction. The contradiction was mercy. By broadcasting details of humane treatment, hot meals, blankets, religious freedom, they weaponized kindness. The goal was not merely to comfort POWs or reassure families, but to detonate disbelief inside the enemy's psyche. Declassified OWI memos from 1945 explicitly mention the strategy. Humanity is our sharpest blade. Mercy contradicts their faith in the Emperor's divine order. When civilians heard that prisoners were fed and clothed, their reaction wasn't joy, it was dread. If the Emperor's enemy was capable of compassion, then perhaps the Emperor's system was capable of deceit. The power of these broadcasts lay not in volume, but in contrast. A single sentence, "Your sons are alive and treated well," carried more moral shock than hours of fiery speeches. It replaced fear with doubt, and doubt was fatal to fanaticism. Across Japan, in darkened rooms and basements, listeners began asking forbidden questions. What if the Americans were not demons? What if surrender was not shame? What if everything they'd been told was a lie? The empire had survived bombs, but it could not survive curiosity. By 1945, the Allied message had achieved its aim. Without firing a shot, America had cracked open Japan's most fortified weapon, the national mind, using nothing more than radios, rice, and mercy. Mercy as a weapon. When Allied planners in Washington and Manila discussed how to break Japan's morale, they faced a dilemma. Bombs could destroy factories, but not faith. Japan's war machine was powered by a belief that surrender meant eternal shame. The Americans realized that to unmake that faith, they needed to make surrender look survivable, even preferable. Thus, the Office of War Information and the Psychological Warfare Branch crafted their most radical tactic: kindness. Instead of threatening annihilation, they would describe comfort. Instead of mocking Japanese soldiers, they would humanize them. Every radio broadcast, every leaflet dropped over cities like Osaka or Fukuoka, followed this same logic: to make the Japanese people doubt the cruelty of the enemy and therefore the righteousness of their own war. Leaflets depicted smiling prisoners eating rice, mending clothes, or reading letters. Broadcasts described medical treatment, recreation time, even concerts in POW camps. To Western audiences, these details seemed mundane, but to a culture conditioned to see surrender as damnation, they were shocking. Allied strategists called it the soft invasion. No troops landed, no guns fired, yet the idea that captured soldiers were being treated as human beings crept into homes and hearts, eroding loyalty from within. One internal memo summarized it bluntly: "They cannot fight forever if they start believing we are better men." It worked. By mid-1945, American intelligence reports recorded growing confusion among civilians and conscripts alike. Some began questioning military orders, others surrendered rather than commit suicide. The empire's ideological walls were cracking from the inside, shattered not by bombs, but by kindness. When compassion becomes psychological warfare. There is a moral paradox at the heart of this campaign. The very act of mercy, which the Americans viewed as humanitarian, was also deliberate manipulation. Feeding prisoners, airing radio reports of free meals. These were real acts of decency, but they were also tools of strategy. This raised questions that still trouble historians. Can kindness be ethical if its goal is surrender? Does mercy lose its purity when it's turned into propaganda? For many Allied officers, the answer was practical. Mercy, they argued, was not deception. It was truth weaponized. "We told no lies," said one OI official in a 1946 interview. "We just let the truth do our work." And indeed, the truth was devastating. Japan's own treatment of prisoners, from Bataan to Changi, had been brutal. By publicizing their own adherence to the Geneva Convention, the Allies not only claimed moral high ground, but also magnified Japan's shame. Yet, among Japanese civilians who later learned of this campaign, the reaction was complex. Some admired the Americans for their restraint. Others felt humiliated, realizing that their government's cruelty had been turned into America's moral advantage. "They conquered us with mercy," one post-war teacher wrote, and that was the hardest defeat to bear. A collision of moral worlds. In traditional Japanese culture, virtue was measured by endurance, not comfort. Pain purified, sacrifice sanctified. To live in luxury while others suffered was dishonor. This ethos shaped Japan's wartime psychology, the belief that to die starving but loyal was nobler than to live under the enemy's mercy. The Allied broadcasts shattered that cultural script. To hear of prisoners eating hot meals was to confront an alien moral system, one where dignity came not from dying, but from being treated justly, even in defeat. Anthropologists studying post-war Japan later called this a moral collision. In 1945, it was chaos. Families who had spent years venerating self-destruction suddenly faced a world where compassion itself had become strength. "It was like learning gravity had reversed," said one survivor decades later. "We were told the Americans were beasts. Then they fed our sons." That contradiction reshaped Japan's collective conscience long after the war ended. The nation that once glorified death learned painfully to respect life. And in that transformation lay the hidden legacy of those broadcasts, not just the collapse of an empire, but the birth of a new moral language. By the time the emperor's voice echoed across Japan on August 15, 1945, telling his people to endure the unendurable, millions had already glimpsed a different truth on their forbidden radios. They had seen that mercy could be mightier than obedience, and that kindness, once feared, could become the foundation of peace. It was late May 1945. Tokyo was a city of embers. The air carried the smell of ash and sea salt, and in the silence between bombings, one could hear only the hum of surviving radios. Electricity flickered unpredictably, but the faint glow of a dial could still pull an entire neighborhood into a whispering trance. Inside a small boarding house in Kanda, a dozen people sat around a wooden table, a shopkeeper, a widow, 2 students, and an elderly teacher whose son had vanished in the Philippines. The room smelled faintly of boiled barley and candle wax. The radio, an old wooden unit wrapped in cloth to muffle sound, crackled softly. They had gathered to hear the enemy. Static hissed, then cleared. A woman's voice, clear, deliberate Japanese without accent, filled the air. "Good evening, people of Japan. This is Radio San Francisco. Today, in camps across the Pacific, captured Japanese soldiers enjoyed a holiday meal of rice, meat, and tea. The United States of America follows the Geneva rules." Prisoners are safe and healthy. For a long moment, no one breathed. The teacher's hands trembled. "Rice?" he whispered. "Even our children have no rice." The voice continued, calm, steady, unhurried. "Your emperor has said that surrender is shame, but we say honor is shown in mercy. Those who live will one day rebuild Japan." Someone gasped. The youngest man, a factory worker, reached out and turned the volume down, terrified that neighbors might hear. The widow stared at the radio as though it were alive. "It cannot be true," she said, shaking her head. But her voice wavered. Then the American announcer spoke a sentence that would be repeated in whispers for weeks to come. "In America, even your sons are fed before our soldiers eat." It was a line crafted by the OE psychologists, gentle, factual, and devastating. The teacher's eyes filled with tears. "My son," he murmured, almost in prayer. "If they feed him, then the war is wrong." The silence that followed was heavy. The group knew that to speak these thoughts aloud was treason, but something in them had shifted irreversibly. The propaganda that had sustained them, the vision of the noble, suffering Japan, cracked under the weight of a single image, their captured sons being treated like human beings. The next morning, the teacher's neighbor was arrested for radio disobedience. The secret police had heard rumors of gatherings. No one spoke for days afterward, but the seed had been planted. People who had never questioned the war before now found themselves wondering, if the enemy was merciful, what did that make their own rulers? Similar moments played out across the country. In Osaka, a factory foreman reported that his workers had become unsettled after hearing that American camps served white rice. In Niigata, a fisherman's wife was beaten for repeating that her captured husband might still be alive. The government tried to drown out the rumors with louder propaganda, but the truth was already seeping through Japan's ruined streets like smoke through broken glass. And as Allied bombers continued their nightly raids, civilians began to listen, not just for the wail of sirens, but for the soft voice that followed in the dark, the voice that spoke not of vengeance, but of food, mercy, and survival. That contradiction became unbearable. For the first time, Japanese citizens were more afraid of their own silence than the enemy's words. One of the students who had attended that gathering later recalled the night vividly in an interview decades later. "We had seen our cities burn, our friends starve, and still we believed we were right. But when the enemy said he fed our soldiers, I felt something break. We had lost the war long before the emperor admitted it. We lost it when we learned that our enemy had more humanity than our leaders." That was the real detonation of 1945, not the firebombs, but the collapse of belief. The empire had demanded death, the enemy had offered life. And for a people taught that divinity justified suffering, that truth was unendurable. As the weeks passed, those nighttime broadcasts became both a ritual and a torment. Every family that secretly tuned in did so with shaking hands, torn between hope and terror. Hope that the rumors of kindness were true. Terror that believing them would destroy everything they had been taught to hold sacred. By July 1945, the Allied Psychological Warfare Branch had refined its message into surgical precision. They no longer spoke about battles or strategy. They spoke about rice, milk, blankets, letters from home, all the things the Japanese people had been denied by their own leaders. One broadcast opened with the phrase, "Your sons in our care receive hot meals and clean water. Would you not do the same for ours?" In Tokyo, that sentence echoed through narrow alleys like a haunting. Shopkeepers whispered it. Teachers repeated it behind closed doors. Even soldiers on leave stared blankly at the ground when it was mentioned. The idea was heresy, yet it was irresistible. One night in a burned-out district of Shizuoka, a group of mothers gathered in a bomb shelter, huddled around a single radio. They had all lost someone, a son, a husband, a brother, presumed dead. The air outside was thick with smoke from the latest raid. Inside, the American broadcast began. "To the mothers of Japan, your sons who surrendered are not dishonored. They are being cared for. They have food, medicine, and letters." One wrote home this week, saying, "They call me by name, not number." The women wept. For years, they had been told that surrender erased a man's soul, that captured soldiers ceased to exist. But here, from the enemy himself, came a voice telling them their sons were alive and seen as human. In one corner, an elderly woman pressed her palms together and whispered, "Then let him live. Let him live even if he cannot return." Those who heard her fell silent. In that small act of prayer, the moral foundation of wartime Japan cracked. For a moment, love had triumphed over loyalty. The Kempeitai, Japan's secret police, did not miss these signs. They increased raids on suspected listeners, confiscated radios, and spread counter-propaganda claiming the Americans were broadcasting poison. But the damage was done. Even those who didn't believe the foreign voices could not stop imagining them. The idea that the enemy could be merciful was impossible to unlearn. At the same time, captured Japanese officers in American camps were recording testimonies about their treatment. Some were later broadcast word for word back into Japan. The voices were familiar, regional accents, polite phrasing, unmistakably genuine. One officer, speaking from a camp in Hawaii, said quietly, "To my family in Kyushu, I am alive. We are given food and treated with fairness. Tell the others not to fear." It was the most dangerous message of all, a Japanese voice confirming American truth. As summer deepened, those voices reached villages that had never seen an airplane, let alone a foreigner. In one rural town near Nara, a farmer's wife later recalled the night her husband heard such a message. "He went outside and sat under the stars," she said. "He looked up for a long time and then said, 'We have been living inside a lie.'" That realization was happening everywhere, in silence, in shame, in awe. And when the emperor finally spoke on August 15th, his soft, trembling voice admitting that Japan must endure the unendurable, the people already knew. They had been prepared for surrender not by their leaders, but by the compassion of their enemies. The war had ended before the atomic clouds even formed. It had ended the moment mercy began to sound louder than orders. When the emperor's voice finally drifted across Japan on August 15, 1945, it was not the voice of a god, but of a man. Thin, fragile, and human. Civilians fell to their knees, not only in grief, but in confusion. For years they had been told that death was preferable to surrender. Yet now the divine himself had surrendered. In homes and shelters across the country, the forbidden radios sat silent. The foreign voices they had once feared had become, in hindsight, prophetic. They had not lied. The Americans had indeed treated prisoners well. Many of those prisoners were coming home. And the civilians who had once trembled in terror now trembled again, this time at the realization that truth had lived on the enemy's tongue. When the occupation began, American troops landed on the same shores that Japan had sworn to defend to the death. But there was no battle. Civilians watched in disbelief as the supposed monsters handed out chocolate, rice, and canned food. Some offered medicine. Some smiled. In the streets of Yokohama and Tokyo, people whispered the same thing. The radio was right. For Japanese families, the most shocking moments came weeks later, when repatriation ships began arriving with captured soldiers, men who had been presumed dead for years. They stepped onto the docks wearing clean American uniforms, healthier than anyone in the crowd. Some carried Red Cross parcels. Some carried photographs taken in the camps, men smiling, eating, standing beside Allied officers. The reunion scenes were surreal. Wives fainted. Mothers clutched sons who had been written off as martyrs. In some homes, these returns caused friction, the living proof that survival had been possible, that the empire had lied. They said the enemy would torture us, one returned soldier told a local paper. Instead, they gave me soup and medicine. The shame is not in surrender. It is in deception. The Japanese press, now under Allied supervision, began cautiously printing stories of POW treatment. The details were mundane: meals, hospitals, sports fields. But the moral impact was seismic. The civilians who read them felt both relief and humiliation. Relief that their loved ones had survived. humiliation that the enemy's kindness had exposed their own cruelty. Many Japanese began to see those wartime broadcasts in a new light. They were not tricks. They were warnings. The Americans spoke truth, a Kyoto teacher later said. We only feared them because we were afraid of ourselves. For occupation authorities, this realization became a cornerstone of reform. The same psychological warfare that had undermined Japan's will to fight now became a foundation for rebuilding its will to live. Leaflets were replaced with textbooks. Broadcasts of mercy gave way to broadcasts of democracy. And the people, weary and hollow, listened, not out of obedience, but out of exhausted belief that truth, finally, was possible again. Yet, even amid rebuilding, guilt lingered. The mothers who had listened to those foreign voices years earlier remembered trembling in the dark, afraid to believe. Many later said that those nights haunted them more than the air raids, not because of fear, but because mercy had frightened them more than violence. In the months after Japan's surrender, truth seeped into the nation like light through broken paper walls. The stories that had once been whispered by forbidden radios were now spoken openly. In classrooms, in markets, even on state-run broadcasts overseen by the Allied occupation. What had been treason in July became history by October. American authorities allowed repatriated POWs to speak publicly about their captivity. Their testimonies were astonishing to civilians raised on fear. The men described meals of rice and meat, access to clean clothes, medical care, and humane guards. They spoke of being called by name rather than number. Some even said they had been shown photographs of their families taken before the war. Small acts meant to keep their spirits intact. At first, people refused to believe. Then, one story after another matched the American radio broadcasts they had once dismissed as propaganda. Everything they said was true, recalled one Tokyo woman. The enemy had fed our sons while we starved. That realization broke Japan's collective heart. It was not merely defeat in war. It was a moral defeat, a collapse of self-image. For centuries, Japan had prided itself on discipline and moral purity. Now it saw that its enemy's strength had been compassion, not conquest. In the ruins of that revelation, a new Japan began to take shape. Teachers who had once lectured about holy death began teaching civic responsibility and individual dignity. The government abolished laws forbidding surrender and erased propaganda glorifying suicide. In the years that followed, Japan's commitment to peace, enshrined in Article 9 of its Constitution, was born not from fear of war, but from shame at what had been believed. Scholars later noted how deeply the wartime broadcasts influenced this transformation. The OWI's psychological warfare campaign was never just about demoralization. It was about re-education. By describing humane treatment, the Americans had unintentionally planted the seeds of democracy, respect, fairness, the idea that power must answer to conscience. Many of the same civilians who had trembled at those broadcasts would later become the voices of Japan's reconstruction. Journalists, teachers, and writers who had listened in secret began publishing essays about truth and responsibility. One former schoolteacher wrote, "We were not defeated by bombs, but by kindness. It is harder to hate someone who spares your children." Even decades later, survivors of those years remembered the emotion of that first broadcast, the shock, the disbelief, the trembling. To them, it marked the moment Japan began to wake up. A widow in Osaka, whose husband had died believing surrender was dishonor, told an interviewer in 1963, "When I heard that the Americans fed prisoners, I cried because I realized he could have lived. He died for a lie. They offered life, and we refused it." Her words captured an entire generation's grief, not just for the dead, but for the truth they had been denied. As Japan rebuilt into one of the most peaceful and prosperous nations in the world, the moral echo of those wartime radios lingered. In school textbooks and museums, historians later summarized it simply: "The voice of the enemy told us who we really were." And so the broadcasts that once filled homes with trembling became, in memory, the beginning of Japan's rebirth, a moment when mercy, carried on invisible waves, defeated an empire. History often remembers wars by their noise, the roar of bombers, the screams of the wounded, the crackle of burning cities. But sometimes the most powerful sound is silence broken by a single voice, calm, foreign, and true. The story of Japanese civilians trembling at the sound of U.S. broadcasts is not about propaganda or victory. It is about the moment when an entire nation glimpsed the moral cost of its obedience. For years, Japan had defined strength as sacrifice and purity as pain. Then, over the static of forbidden radios, came a new definition: strength as compassion, power as restraint. The Americans had used mercy as a weapon, but its impact reached beyond strategy. It reintroduced humanity to a people who had been told to abandon it. The enemy's kindness did what no bomb could. It made Japan question itself. That questioning became the foundation of rebirth. In the years that followed, when Japanese citizens built a new democracy upon peace and individual dignity, they were unknowingly honoring those unseen voices from the sky, the men and women who spoke not of revenge, but of meals, medicine, and mercy. Every war ends with treaties and ruins, but this one ended with something rarer: understanding. The mercy that once frightened civilians into silence eventually became the cornerstone of their freedom. If bombs destroy bodies, truth restores souls. And sometimes the most enduring victory is not won on the battlefield, but whispered through the air. A quiet reminder that decency, even when used as strategy, can still heal the world it was meant to conquer.